Well, Barry, last week we discussed a bunch of stuff related to the fiscal cliff, and today we want to focus on one of those, namely the use of fiscal rules, what they are and why we need them. Barry, you are muted, so you better unmute yourself to share your wisdom with our viewers.
There I am, unmuted. Okay. So let's talk about fiscal rules.
Yeah. Oh, I thought you were going to start.
Okay. Well, here is my thoughts about fiscal rules in this country, and the basic fact is that they don't work. And to understand this, we can go back and look a little bit about the background of fiscal rules. At the federal level, we don't have any fiscal rules in our Constitution. And what we had for several centuries was an unwritten fiscal rule, something I call the old-time fiscal religion. And basically, elected officials are expected to balance the budget, and you might run deficits and incur debt in the short term for an emergency and war, but you were expected then in peacetime to generate surplus revenue to offset those deficits. And so in the long term, the country actually did not incur debt on a long-term basis. And that really continued right up into the post-Second World War period. In the 1950s, Harry Truman and Eisenhower both were committed to balancing the budget. And Harry Truman said during the Korean War, we're going to have to spend more money on defense, so we have to cut back on other spending to balance the budget. So basically, we had this unwritten rule that you balance the budget in the long term. Well, that changed during the 1960s with the Vietnam War and the Great Society programs. I'm afraid our elected officials decided we could have both guns and butter. We could just spend our way to achieve whatever we needed. So, not surprisingly, we started to incur deficits and accumulate debt in the long run at an unsustainable rate. So, the real break in fiscal rules comes in the 1980s during the Reagan years. In those years, I think it was recognized that this was not sustainable. We couldn't just continue to accumulate debt. So Congress passed the Balanced Budget Act in 1985, Graham-Rudman as it's often referred to, that basically required the federal government to balance the budget and to not incur debt. And by the 1990s, this seemed to be working. In the 1990s, we in fact balanced the budget, stabilized debt. Debt as a share of GDP was declining in those years. So it looked like we'd figured this out, and we had some effective fiscal rules. Well, for the last 2 decades, we've abandoned those statutory fiscal rules. Basically, we either circumvent them or suspend them. So Congress has again, for 2 decades now, incurred deficits and accumulated debt at an unsustainable rate. So the challenge now is, what do we do? What do we do about our fiscal rules that don't seem to be working very well?
Yeah, let me clarify for our viewers, Barry, when you just first started out, you said fiscal rules don't work. The ones we've had haven't worked.
Absolutely.
There are countries where they have fiscal rules, Switzerland, Germany, Sweden, and where they do work. And probably, correct me if I'm wrong, probably what we need is an American version of one of those sets of fiscal rules embedded in our Constitution so that they can't easily be ignored in the so-called spending / budget making process, and so that we stabilize our debt as a share of GDP at some non-astronomical amount.
Yeah, I think Switzerland is sort of the gold standard in terms of fiscal rules. they have the most effective fiscal rules any country has adopted. And I think the key is they're in the Constitution.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult for the Swiss elected officials to ignore their fiscal rules. And back in the 1980s and 1990s, Switzerland was accumulating debt at an unsustainable rate. So 2 decades ago, they passed what's called the debt brake. And basically, it's a very effective rule for several reasons. One is it caps the growth of spending at the long-term rate of growth of the economy. And secondly, if the country does have an emergency and incurs deficits, they have to offset those deficits within 6 years. So that's debt brake then prevents them from accumulating debt in the long term. So you're absolutely right. I think that we need Swiss-type fiscal rules to begin to constrain debt at the federal level. Actually, in this country, at the state level and local level, we have 2 centuries of effective fiscal rules in their constitutions and statutes. At the state level, we have balanced budget requirements, debt limits, tax and spending limits, other fiscal rules that we've been living with for 2 centuries. So the bottom line is we know these work. At the state level, they've been working for centuries. So what I would argue is that we can no longer leave this to the discretion of elected officials at the national level. And actually, the states have the power to enact fiscal rules at the federal level. Under Article 5 of the Constitution, the states can propose a fiscal rules as an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And we are now working to do that. We're working, we need 2/3 of the states to propose this type of amendment. We're very close now. We have 28 states. And so I think within the next year or so, we're going to be able to have the states propose a fiscal rule, a fiscal responsibility amendment to the U.S. Constitution under Article 5.
Yeah, we want to keep these short, so we're going to cover some additional issues next week. For our viewers that would like to get more detail on this, you could pick up our book, A Fiscal Cliff, from the Cato Institute, also Amazon, or visit policytalk.org, our website, and go to the fiscal sustainability item on our Tier 1 menu and learn more. And please correspond with us, provide us feedback.